Big data and energy. These are sectors that are fundamentally related, both in terms of the quality and quantity of data and in terms of the usefulness of using big data to perform analysis. Let's consider wind energy. It's been growing greatly in the last few years, especially in the windy places in the United States, not surprisingly. The windiest parts of the U.S. are the northern plains like Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and then Colorado and Kansas, more in the central part of the country, and then the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma are great wind farms, they're great wind farms as well. These are big business. People such as Google have been investing money in it. Old school energy companies have been investing money in it. If we look at it, wind energy is definitely increasing its prevalence within the U.S. and also probably will continue to do so given the environmental concerns with fossil fuels. Down here at the bottom right, we can actually see the growth in wind energy compared to other forms of energy within Texas. And what's interesting about it is you'll see a fairly reasonable increase there in the light gray, but the problem is, at least from an environmental perspective, the fossil fuels have increased at a far greater rate to date. So my project is looking at the ERCOT electric transmission grid and statistics that we can pull in real time from it. And then I've been correlating that information with outside data sources, which can hopefully answer some interesting questions. At the top right, you see the extent of the ERCOT grid. It really is centered for providing power for the bulk of the Texas population, which are sort of outside of the Panhandle and extreme western Texas. Within the state, there is a fair amount of wind. If you look there in the Texas Panhandle, the large green swath there, that is prime wind farm country. The land is flat. It's used either for oil production or for grazing, so there's not a lot of competition for land. It's cheap. And even though that section is not part of ERCOT, that does provide a significant amount of power into ERCOT. You will see down there in Texas near the Mexican border, there's actually some red zones, which are even better wind areas. Theoretically speaking, practically speaking, they're not as good because of the terrain there not being quite as flat. So some of the questions that we might be able to ask from the data that we're scraping, we're essentially scraping grid capacity, demand, and wind generation right now I'm scraping twice every 3 minutes. I'm really only analyzing about 4 readings an hour, so about once every 15 minutes. So one question is there a correlation between overall demand and wind generation? So this question is, when the price for electricity is high, do people produce wind power? And that's kind of a silly question at some level because you think, well, wind power comes from the wind. When the wind's not blowing, you can't do anything. But there is a cost to running wind generation, and so there might actually be some correlation between when wind power gets turned on. A similar question is, can we look and see if wind is the primary factor in wind power generation? Maybe it is a situation where people are simply building windmills, plugging them into the grid, and letting them run essentially autonomously. Another question is there a correlation between wind generation and grid capacity? Because the grid capacity fluctuates over time. And one possible reason for this fluctuation is because as the wind picks up, perhaps more wind power is coming in, and so consequently the overall capacity is higher. And then a final question is there a relationship between wind generation and the price of wholesale power? Intuitively, you wouldn't think so, but if you know about the Texas deregulated electricity market, you'd actually think that there probably is a relationship. So in Texas, the power is dispatched in, I believe it's 15-minute increments And in each one of these chunks of power, many providers are bidding into the ERCOT system, and ERCOT has an automated auction that runs, like I said, every 15 minutes and decides who is going to be dispatched, which plants are going to be used, which windmills are going to be used. It does that by stacking all of the bids. You can essentially think of like Oreo cookies, and each Oreo cookie represents some amount of power, but each Oreo cookie doesn't cost the same. And so they actually stack these bids, so our Oreo cookies, from least expensive to most expensive, and then count up what the total capacity that they think they need is, and then lop the stack of Oreo cookies off at that point, and everybody below that point gets to generate power, and they all make what the top price is. And so consequently, if any expensive energy is dispatched, everybody generating gets a good price. If inexpensive energy is dispatched, everybody generating gets a low price. And the system is designed this way to make sure that there is enough power in the system at all times to meet demand. So let's look at some of the data here. At the bottom right, you'll see the actual data that ERCOT provides. This is a snapshot, but it's scraped from the ERCOT website. Anybody can point their web browser at it and get this information. We see this piece was taken from February 16th, 2013. There were, I believe that's 30,000 kilowatt hours, so 30 megawatt hours of system demand, 35 megawatt hours of total capacity, and then 2 megawatt hours of wind capacity. The frequency and instantaneous time error have to do with the physical measurements on the system, and then these DC ties are connections to other off-grid power supplies, and as you can see, they're pretty minor. Here at the top right, we have just a snapshot of what the data that I'm scraping looks like in its stored form. I'm using the Amazon S3 storage system to store it. This is in part because it's cheap and easy to use. It's also in part because I'm using the Amazon EC2 system to perform the scraping. So it's just using one API, and SDK simplifies development. Over here at the left, you'll see I just did a quick Google Trends search for various energy providers, 5 different ones within the state of Texas that provide power within ERCOT. And this is just the sort of information you can correlate. Perhaps high wind generation has something to do with the number of people, perhaps the number of people searching for wind power providers has something to do with the amount of wind power produced. Or alternatively, maybe high prices cause people to search for wind power, or maybe low prices do. So let's take a look at the data. Taken just our basic capacity, demand, and wind information, thrown it into Splunk, which is a big data exploration tool, and we can see the relationship of these pieces of information over time. You'll see, obviously, that wind power is fairly low in a steady band, as is capacity and demand. Kind of an interesting question that we can ask, especially as we start thinking towards longer term. I'm very interested in prediction mechanisms, especially price predictions. And as we all learned in Economics 101, price and demand are related. Higher demand leads to higher prices. So one fundamental question is, when is demand naturally high? Obviously, demand is naturally high in the summertime when everybody wants to run their air conditioning. But we can also see sort of daily trends. So this data here is looking at the demand by hour over time. And so we can look at the minimum, which is our yellow line, the average, which is our red, and our max, which is blue. In reality, for price predictions, we probably care actually about that max number. We want to know when these things are peaking, and especially when they peak badly, because most of the money to be made or lost in power occurs at the peaks. And that's just because when demand spikes, the prices go through the roof. And so you can get caught both ways if you're an electricity provider or marketer. if you've bought options on electricity the wrong way of the market swing, you can lose a lot of money, potentially even go bankrupt. And that actually does happen fairly often especially among power providers who don't produce their own power, which is reasonably common in the Texas market. So let's take a look at the drop in prices, or let's take a look at prices. This is price data scraped from before March 10th. ERCOT's got quite rich historical price information that we can look at, and if we were willing to pay the $10,000 a month to subscribe, we could actually have a live feed of this. And realistically, anybody trading power does pay for the live feed, so they know exactly what the price is in real time. So I can see a couple of interesting things. Prices spiked here in early February or mid-February, and it's also really dropped in March, but then it spiked back up later in March. So when I look at predicting price spikes, we can look at a couple things. What happens when the wind generation is high and the remaining capacity is low? So I define remaining capacity as capacity available minus demand. I say the wind generation is high if it's above 3 megawatt hours. And so we group it this, we actually see two price spikes within the time range of this data. Now, if we kind of expand this and say, what do we want to do with this data? We really want a predictor. And so what we're looking at here is a visualization mock-up I've created based upon the data that I've got. And what I think is probably the single most relevant question that we have a shot at answering, which is the price about to go up? It's important both for prediction, and it's also important for consumers if as smart meters and smart homes become the new fad. It's useful to be able to put something in the house that not just says what the price is right now, but maybe you should stop running the dryer because the electricity prices are about to go up. And so one factor that our data shows is an issue in price spikes is wind generation. And this has to do with wind generation. It appears has some subsidy within Texas, forcing it to be dispatched at certain times. And when it gets dispatched, it's extremely expensive power. And so consequently, the prices spike up. This also could be because in order for wind power to be dispatched, there must be nothing else left because it's more expensive than, say, natural gas. And so as a result, if it gets dispatched, it's just a signal that other power plants are maybe out of commission. And that does happen pretty regularly. And that can also, those prices can also fluctuate, say, with the price of the underlying commodities. If the price of natural gas spikes 50%, which it's extremely volatile, so it can do that, that may mean that wind is suddenly economic and gets dispatched because natural gas is no longer economic. So in this mock-up, it's kind of like a speedometer. It's a two-layer speedometer. The outer portion of it is demand. The inner portion of it is wind supply. The red areas indicate problems that could indicate price spikes. Obviously, if the demand goes through the roof, you're going to get price spikes. That's just basic economics. And so if this outer gray bar runs into the red zone, we're expecting a price spike. But also similarly, the little red section here in the wind bar, or in the wind band, is tied to the gray bar for demand. So as that demand moves around, this red area for wind shifts. It changes sizes based upon the historic data that we've tracked. And so if the wind bar moves into that red zone, we're predicting a price spike. And like any good visualization, we want to be able to take a look at the past and see what's happened with other data, and so consequently we can change the date. We can look at this over different time spans, maybe as low as granular as 15 minutes, as wide as a month. We can take a look at historic numbers. We see the dashed blue line indicates the current demand against the gray line of historic demand, and then the dashed green is current wind plotted against historic wind in our actual moving chart here. And so we can select a day. We also see the current price versus prior prices with similar circumstances over here at the left. The demand tolerance, the wind tolerance, and season filter let me, the user, customize what I'm looking at. So for example, the season makes a big difference. In the wintertime in Texas, there's just not a lot of interesting stuff going on. The air conditioners are off. It's a pleasant 70 degrees, so you're not running lots of extra power for any reason. So consequently, winter and summer are going to look really different. And certain types of spikes in the winter might not cause a price spike, but the exact same spikes in capacity or demand in the summer very well might. This tolerance lets us kind of set that fudge factor for, we know that this is based on real data, and real data is, you can overfit to it very easily. So you can make false conclusions because you tailored your conclusions to the data. And so we put some fudge factors on them to allow us to kind of predict ahead of time. And then over time, we can refine this model a bit. Using all of this data and a visualization like this, I believe that one can create the ability to predict price spikes due to wind power in Texas from publicly and freely available data. And consequently, one can build a fairly useful tool without really having to spend lots of money developing it, and can, as we've seen, this is running on cloud systems that cost something on the order of $10 to $15 a month, which is quite cost effective. And just simply we need to build the visualization here and deploy that online in order to have a fully working system.